Good afternoon. This is an oral argument in case number 17-4049-NMP, which involves an application from ACORN Energy Solar 2 for a certificate of public good for a 150 kilowatt net metered solar generation facility at 869 Wash Point Road in Shoreham, Vermont. My name is Anthony Roisman. I am chairman of the Public Utility Commission. With me are Commissioners Margaret Cheney on my right and Sarah Hoffman on my left. This oral argument has been scheduled at the request of several of the adjoining landowners that have intervened in the case. As we explained in our order, the oral argument is scheduled for 1 hour, with the interveners allocated 1/2 of that time and the remainder to be used by the other parties. Please note the clock that's on the wall bears no resemblance to the actual time. We apologize for that. We'll start with appearances with the department.
Alex Wing from the Department of Public Service.
Leslie Cadwell, legal counsel and advocate for the Town of Shoreham Planning Commission. And with me at council table is George Gross, who's the chair of the Planning Commission.
We'll just take one part, just in case.
Cindy Hill for the interveners, and here with me is Teresa Holmes and Joanne Madison.
Benjamin Marks Attorney at Law, PC, for the ACORN Energy Solar 2 LLC, and with me is Chris Lamonia of Aegis Renewables, who are the contractors who are building the project.
All right. I think the order that we should start with is with the party that requested the oral argument. So, Ms. Hill, you have 30 minutes. Do you wish to reserve any time for your rebuttal?
I'll reserve 5 minutes for rebuttal.
Okay, and before you start, let me just get the timing for everyone else. Mr. Marks, you and the other parties have 30 minutes. Have you discussed how you're going to divide that time?
We have, and we've agreed that AES2 will go first for about 20 minutes, and the other parties will use the remaining 10 minutes between them.
Okay, all right. And the remaining 10 minutes, have you decided how you're dividing that?
The remaining 10 minutes will be evenly divided between the Town of Shoreham and the Department of Public Service.
Okay, great. All right, good. Thank you. All right, now let's start.
Thank you very much. This is not your usual 150 kW solar array. It involves an extensive amount of excavation. There are hydrological issues, regards berms and extensive earthworks outside of the project lease area. And it has involved a lot of uncertainty and conflicting testimony that has evolved and changed right up through the technical hearing. It involves a number of inaccuracies in filings, as the hearing officer pointed out, and missing items such as no greenhouse gas analysis. I think that the starting point for this being an outlier in 150 kW arrays is that, as is stated in the record several times, the site as it now exists is not suitable for the solar development. I have brought here, this is was used at the technical hearing. This photograph is a blow-up of one of the exhibits. It's actually a photograph by the petitioners of the site. And you can see the ridge line on it, and the ridge line is sloping towards the north, and so the current configuration of the site is not suitable for solar development. There was going to be extensive excavation, removal of the trees on top of that ridge, and that ridge line that you can see running down obliquely through the center of the photo is going to be excavated, and according to the excavation diagrams, excavated down to level with that wetland that you see on the left-hand side of the page.
Can you tell me what exhibit that is?
If I could read it.
Is it on there?
It's on there, and it's in the transcript, and I apologize, I didn't know, but it's on there super tiny. Oh, actually, Ben, do you have the exhibit number? Because this is the response to, it was provided in Discovery, and the Discovery response number is on there. I'll give you that exhibit.
I can look it up now.
Yeah,
That's
thank you. Give you that exhibit number. All right. So, as a preliminary matter, I did want to just reiterate in the hearing officer's proposal for decision. There were a couple of items that the hearing officer proposed adding to the evidentiary record, and we did file our objection to that. No one has moved those items into evidence. They are items that arrived, I believe, after the close of evidence, and particularly in regards to the Addison County Regional Planning letter, it says it's a preliminary letter, that there was going to be a meeting of a committee to talk about it and then send something later, and nothing else ever came. So I believe it's quite inappropriate to put that letter into evidence when it's clear that it's not even a complete statement or filing.
And you made that point.
And I made that point, right, yeah, so I just wanted to.
Let me suggest, given your limited time,
Yep.
if you've written it to us,
Yep.
we are aware of it.
Okay, I hope so. There has been a lot of paper here, though, so I just wanted to, and that's, I will just point out that the highlights, because there has been some extensive briefing, and in going back over our comments on proposal for decision and our brief and reply brief, we did cover, particularly in our initial brief, covered most of these matters in depth. So, but I wanted to start by discussing the major amendment issue, and that is that on August 17th, 2018, about 3 weeks before the technical hearing was scheduled, extensive new filings were filed by the applicant, and this is really the first time that we learned of the magnitude of this project and learned of a lot of new information about what this project was like. And although presenting it here, and we argued it in terms of this should have been considered a major amendment, most of those items also go to the substantive CPG criteria as well. So they're both argument that it should be considered a major amendment, and then alternatively they go to the 248 argument. Those changes involve the limits of disturbance, soil capacity, drainage, primag lands, wetlands, traffic, construction impacts, and the greenhouse gas analysis. This was, the August 17th filing was the first time we learned that materials would be hauled off-site. The first mention of the use of dump trucks and the dump truck traffic, although the extent of that really was not revealed until cross-examination at technical hearing. The first mention of construction of these enormous earthwork berms for on-site storage of primag soils and perhaps other overburden as well. A new grading plan, a new site plan. And one thing I wanted to draw your attention to, because I think that I missed this point in my brief. I believe in our brief we talked about the berms adding 20% area to the solar array. And one of the points of a major amendment, of course, they talked about, the major amendment really talks about moving the limits of disturbance by 50 feet. These berms are 40 feet wide, but they're 300 and some odd feet long and 8 feet high, so they're quite enormous despite the narrowness of them. But I had calculated that at, I think, about a 20% increase of the size. I would ask you, however, to look at the original petitioner's Exhibit JM2, Mr. Matosky's Exhibit 2, which is the site plan. And it says that the construction area is 1.42 acres. And if you look at the August 17th JM2 revised, it says the construction area is now 2.2 acres. So that's an increase of 0.8 acres. So from 1.4 to 2.2 is actually more than a 50% increase in the construction area from the original filing to these August 17th filings. And I would suggest that a more than 50% increase in the size and the construction area of the project, the disturbed area of the project, should be considered a major amendment. This is not a small, this is not just adding some shrubbery or some other sort of minor mitigation or reconfiguring the project just, for purposes of some, minor site issues that arose. This is a 50% addition in the construction area of the project.
Ms. Hill,
Yep.
I want to make sure I understand what you believe. Is the implication of that, is it that there was more process that would have been gone through if this had been treated as a major or a minor amendment? Or is it that you have not had an opportunity, or your client has not had an opportunity to make whatever arguments you want to make about the amended changes?
It's a combination of both, Mr. Richmond, in that as a major amendment, it would have gone back to original notice to all parties. So agencies like, agencies from the department to the Agency of Agriculture to Agency of Natural Resources, need time to review these things, and having had the original application that didn't have all of this earthwork on it and didn't have this scale of construction area on it, they looked at the project and, so be it, didn't chime in and didn't come into it. When the revised plans were filed with a motion for a minor amendment this late in the game, that's an awful short turnaround, and it is not notice to all of those, to not enough time and not enough notice to everyone. We did get some small.
Did the department, has DNR get notice?
I assume they were in on the case, so
They're
they got notice of it, yes. But when you go back and reset it, then you actually have the process. Now we had this notice 3 weeks before hearing that now we finally see the magnitude of this project. There certainly was an incredible crunch of time to try to do some discovery, to try to have experts look at this, to try to consider what the ramifications of it would be. As a result of that, as the hearing officer points out, because of our swift round of discovery that we did on these changes, additional and different and inconsistent testimony about it came out at the hearing. So rather than that information being flushed out earlier in the game when it could have been addressed, or when revised filings might have come in to address it, it came out in the course of the hearing.
Did you request an extension of the dates for the hearing once this amendment was filed and you were aware of the nature of the changes?
I don't recall if we did. I do know, remember that we applied for the discovery and we got the discovery. I'm not recalling offhand. I think that might have been the compromise to the extension. I think we moved for an extension, but said no extension, but we got the round of discovery, I believe.
And after the hearing, or during the course of the hearing, when you realized, as testimony came out and more of this impact or potential impact became aware, did you ask for additional hearing dates in the future in order to complete what you felt was needed to fully evaluate what they were proposing to do?
No, we did not in those terms. What we asked for was that this be considered a major amendment so that it be kicked back in the process, so that us and everyone would have a chance to take their time to go through it, which that's my understanding of what that minor and major amendment is not that if it's a major amendment, you don't deal with it on the fly like this. You get a reset so that there is that time to go through it, and that is exactly what we were asking for. So that was the mode of our request, was that it be considered a major amendment. One of the changes, for example, that came out at the hearing that wasn't in any of the prior testimony, but that had come out as a result of our round of discovery, the PFD at footnote 21 notes the transcript segments where petitioners, witnesses, both Bain and Matoski, so the project manager for Aegis and then the engineer Matoski, attested in response to questioning regarding discovery responses to this effect, that they'd be removing, I think it was 533 cubic yards of loam off of the construction access road. So that's prime ag soil. The entire site is prime ag soil. It's all either statewide or nationwide. And that they would be removing 533 cubic yards. and that they didn't know where that was gonna be put for storage. And then, and I would note also that the petitioner never updated their original exhibit NM8, which was the agricultural soils impact maps, after this information was revealed and after their August 18th filings. So what's confusing to me, and I think inappropriate, is the hearing officer points out that there was a discrepancy between what the pre-filed testimony and even their August revised pre-filed testimony was and what they testified to at trial in terms of what the level of prime agricultural soil impact was going to be, potentially what the limits of disturbance were going to be, because they didn't know where they were going to put this additional soil that was being excavated. And at that point, however, he says in regards to, and this also impacts the traffic, these are dump trucks running material, on and off. It's unclear if this soil is going somewhere, where it's going. It's construction noise, it's the level of excavation. And the hearing officer proposes that to resolve the discrepancy regarding the removal of the loam from the construction access drive by saying, we'll just have them do what they put in their pre-filed, so they won't be allowed to excavate that. But then, he goes on to say that this wasn't a major amendment because all of the information was developed through the course of the hearing and on cross-examination, so now there's a full record about what's really going to happen with the project. But then says, well, we'll just ignore what they testified to and take and say that they have to do what was in the pre-filed. So it's very confusing to me. The hearing officer does correctly state the applicant's pre-filed materials were inaccurate regarding the level of disturbance, limits of disturbance in the excavation, where the excavated materials are going, the amount of truck traffic. He does say that they never did their greenhouse gas evaluation. He says then the record was developed at the technical hearing, but then observes that the technical hearing testimony was different than what was submitted before and says, so we'll just ignore the testimony at the technical hearing.
I want to make sure I understand where your client wants to go with this. Is your client concerned that there's an adverse impact associated with this additional construction or activity that's going to go on that impacts your client? Or is it a process argument? The client believes that the process that was used wasn't proper and that the application should be turned down because there were certain steps that were supposed to be taken and they weren't taken. Not that those failures result in some adverse impact directly on your client. Which is it?
It's both, in that these changes affect numerous of the 248 criteria, and we would submit that given the way this came in, there is not sufficient evidence on the record for you to make affirmative findings on any number of criteria, including soil capacity, and the wetlands impacts and the aesthetic impacts, and that relates to the fact that there's things that were required to be put in, like the basic information, like the limits of disturbance, the grades of finished product, the grades of the finished site, greenhouse gas emission analysis, basic things that are on the list that you're supposed to have in your application weren't there. And as they finally came in, they came in inaccurately and with conflicting testimony, not conflicting between, there were some conflicts between the intervener's experts and the petitioner, but the petitioner's own testimony conflicting with what they'd already put in. And how are you to do an appropriate analysis or review of it when you don't actually learn what the project is going to be until cross-examination at the technical hearing?
And did you cross-examine on these issues
Yes.
at the hearing?
Yes, and that's noted in, and as I said, the hearing officer notes their responses, and then says, but we'll just ignore that and go with what was in the pre-file. So I don't believe that that's appropriate or accurate. They testified as to what they were going to do, and it was in excess of what was in the pre-filed information.
I mean, just want to
Yep.
make sure I understand the point here. It sounds like the point you're making is your client's opposed to this project existing at this location, period. One of the ways they could object to it is to say it's directly adversely impacting me. I don't know what it's going to look like or something. Another way is to say, I don't want it here, and if I can find that they failed to properly follow the rules, I could get it rejected even though those failures don't directly impact me. Are you saying that it's primarily the second point with regard to this issue?
I'm saying it's both because this issue ties to all of those other impacts like the construction noise, but also the aesthetics, and then it also ties directly to the hydraulics issues and wetlands that are of, so the aesthetic issues are of particular interest to all of these interveners, and like the Madisons who own a significant portion of the surrounding land but live up the road, the Holmes who view whose property is the uphill on that illustration. So the aesthetic impact and the aesthetic impact of these huge berms and of the excavation and the question of what the site is going to be decommissioned to be when they're removing almost 400 cubic yards from the site. So those all relate to aesthetic issues and are very important. They also relate to what this project is ultimately going to look like, which ties into the hydrology because of the fact that they're going to have to excavate. One of the live issues at the trial, at the technical hearing, is the question of what is that excavation going to be comprised of. And I'll parse it out in a moment, but there's significant evidence on the record that what that ridge is bedrock, and that the excavation of that bedrock is going to potentially have a fairly profound impact on this wetland, which is from a spring on my client Teresa Holmes' property and the wetlands on her property. So it ties together. And the impact of what the excavations, which the full extent of which were just revealed at the hearing, and the full extent of these berms, which really were just revealed at the in the revisions and then at the hearing, relate back to this hydrology situation.
Can I ask a couple
Yep.
questions about the aesthetics?
Yes.
One, I know you have a different point about the berms, that
Yep.
you feel they were sprung upon you, but do your clients object to the berms?
Yes, and in terms of the aesthetics, well, for two reasons. One is it is part of the uncertainty about the hydraulics and the wetlands here and how it is going to work. Another is we certainly do have the concern of they aren't in the leased area, and they are steep slopes. They're 2-to-1 slopes on the berms, and they're wrapping around another wetlands that's related to this one. So we have concerns about their maintenance, what they're going to look like. There were no, physical renderings, no photo simulations. I don't know what they're going to look like. They're going to be huge earthworks. So there is concern about what they're going to look like based on uncertainty and also to the extent Michael Lawrence, the intervener's landscape architect, did provide some line of sight diagrams looking at are these berms actually going to block any views, and came to the conclusion that in terms of aesthetic impact, there could be some blocking of the lower support structures of the panel from some close views on Basin Harbor Road, but that it was going to be effectively negligible. And he, at the technical hearing, submitted some renderings that he had come up with that show those line of sight showing the height of the berms and how it wasn't actually going to
And did your
block the
expert
aesthetics.
actually, I'm sorry, wasn't going to?
Wasn't going to block the views of the project.
And did your expert actually propose other aesthetic mitigation?
So the aesthetic mitigation proposed by Mr. Lawrence was primarily the looking at alternative sites on the property.
But other than that, I do
And
know
other than
that. I do know that.
what he did not draw a landscaping plan. What he suggested was that robust plantings along to the west of the array, would be appropriate, and to the south regarding Holmes property, but certainly to the west regarding the view from Mason Harbor Road. And Mr. Boucher, the department's landscape architect, had suggested plantings to the north along the view from the Watchtower Road, which Mr. Lawrence concurred with. So while there was not a specific landscaping plan submitted, the suggestion that effectively no landscaping has been proposed to mitigate the views from Basin Harbor Road. The 2 maple trees that were between Basin Harbor Road and the project have now been moved well north of the project, up behind the barn, where they won't, if you take a look again at exhibit petitioners JM2 revised, the August revision, those trees aren't between a line of sight and the project from anywhere. They're behind the barn and they're north of the project, so they're not going to provide any.
What do you mean by new?
They, in petitioners JM2, in the original site plan, the maple trees were proposed to be directly west of about the center of the array, so that's between Mason Harbor Road and the project. And in the revision, and the testimony was that this was done as a result of the landowner's request due to haying plans in the field. Instead of being down here in the middle of the array, they're moved up here actually north of the array.
I understand now. I thought you were talking about the maple trees on the property.
No, and the
Which
maple
didn't
trees
seem
on the
like-
side are being taken down.
Right.
They're
That's what
gone.
I understood. I was a
Yeah.
little confused.
Yeah,
about
no, there's
those
maple trees to be planted, which now
Thank you.
effectively serve no mitigation.
Ms. Gill, you're getting near the end of
Yep.
your start time. I would like you to talk just for a moment about the alternative sites. My first question is has your client identified an alternative site which, if it were chosen, your client would no longer object to the project?
Yes, Mr. Lawrence sketched the alternative site in his report, missing the exhibit number. The interveners ML something, probably 2, on the, at the penultimate page, is actually a rough sketch, I won't call it a site plan, a rough sketch of a location, again, down behind that barn and farm complex. It's significantly lower in elevation. It would be visually tied to the farm complex. It's level ground requiring no excavation, a much shorter access
I'm
road.
sorry, I don't want to,
Yep.
want you to use up your time, just
Yep.
to answer my one question.
Yes.
If it were moved there, would your client no longer object to the project?
If it were moved there with some modest hedgerow plantings, yes, that would be.
Okay,
Yes.
that's all
So in my brief moments remaining, I did want to talk about the hydrology, the site hydraulics, and the wetlands. Again, the existing grades unacceptable for solar development. The petitioner's wetlands expert said that her attempts to access the ground to take some ground boring were experienced rock refusals at 18 inches. That is, she hit bedrock at 18 inches. The intervener's expert hydrologist, Steve Ravel, who's extremely familiar with this area, has worked there extensively, says this is a limestone bedrock ridge, and that the spring is coming up behind that ridge. That's why we've got a wetlands there. And Jeremy Matoski, the applicant's engineer, attested as to the soils there from the National Soil Conservation Service brochures that this is both Virgins clay, which says you've got a water table at 1 to 3 feet, and covering this ridge is Farmington soils, which say the depth to bedrock is 20 to 40 inches. And these folks say they're going to excavate down 6 feet or so to level off this ridge to that wetland area, and yet they have done no subsurface analysis. And Mr. Ravel's testimony was when you excavate that ridge down to level, that water is either going to flow across, or because you're going to fracture that bedrock and change the underground hydrology, you have a good probability of dewatering the Holmes Springs, that is dewatering the wetlands that's on their property that they want to have there.
The homes are down gradient?
No, they are up gradient, So this fence line divides the Holmes property. This is going uphill to the south. This is the site, this is the ridge that would be excavated down to level with this wetland to put the solar array in. And the Holmes' spring is up in this vicinity, and this is water flowing from that. So when they cut the bedrock down here, without having done subsurface evaluation of this site, any number of things can happen with this. One is that the spring is coming out because of the way the groundwater flows with this bedrock ridge. You're going to change it. The spring may well drain. You probably all had that experience when they blasted for your road or something, and the springs and the water flows change. The spring may well dewater, or those berms may wind up holding this water back and flooding it. And we've submitted evidence at the technical hearing of another Aegis development 1 mile away in Shoreham on the same soils with the same testimony that there wasn't a risk of flooding or drainage problem. And the year after they built it, the place flooded extensively, and they had to go back in and get a level 1 wetlands permit and dredge it out, and it's Virgin's clay. It holds the water.
So the problem here, your expert did not have the geologic data to reach a conclusion as to whether or not any of those things would happen. And your position is it was the burden of the applicant to develop that geologic and hydrogeologic data, not your obligation, your client's obligation to develop it and come to a conclusion. Is that correct?
Mostly correct. The state of the evidence is Mr. Revell did attest, based on his 40 years of experience in this geographical area and as a hydrologist, that is a limestone bedrock ridge, and that you've got groundwater flows underneath of it, and that's how the water is flowing in this particular site. And so there will be changes when you excavate it.
And does that
Yep.
ridge go up onto the Holmes' property? I mean,
Yeah.
it looks like it from the photograph.
Yep, that ridge continues on right up, and Mr. Revell attested in this area of the Champlain Valley, there are lots of these north-south limestone ridges, has to do with how the rock was laid down, and then so we get these north-south wetlands as the water's trying to go west and then is hitting these ridges and pooling up behind them. And again, the Soil Conservation Service data also supports that because the types of soil here typically have bedrock 20 to 40 inches down, and they're going to be excavating well beyond that.
So
Yep.
we have 5 minutes left for your rebuttal.
Right, thank you.
All right.
Thanks very much. So we have about 20 minutes, and I think we're going to divide this up among some comments on the process to address comments made by Attorney Hill, talk about this pesky 500 cubic yards of material that's been floating around in briefs, which in fact is a phantom, and then talk a little bit about the drainage issue at the end. And I hope my colleagues will keep me on task in terms of the amount of time.
I would also like you to make some time available to talk about alternative sites.
Alternative sites, got it. All right. First, a note about the process. In preparing for this hearing today, I decided it was time to get to the bottom of what seems to be a misunderstanding about the amount of earth that's going to be moved around on site. No earth will be moved from the driveway portion of this or the laydown area. It is true that under the original version of the plans that was submitted in 2017, there was a plan to remove loam from the driveway area. However, when the new plans were submitted to deal with prime ag soil concerns of the hearing officer, and frankly of the town of Shoreham, who wanted to know where the prime ag soil was going to be when the project was constructed, the new plans clearly show that there's no change to the grade of the driveway area. There's just no earth moving that's going to be there. The berms are entirely going to be constructed of topsoil that's removed from the site where the array is. And they'll be stored there so that they can be used in site restoration at the end of the project's life. They will also provide a modest screening benefit by screening a portion of the bottom of the array. But we've had some back and forth in the post-hearing filings about moving 500 some odd cubic yards of material, and that simply is off-site, and that's simply not going to happen.
While you're on this, can you just address the question about the area where the ledge is supposed to be and where excavation down to 6 feet is proposed to be done?
Yes, so just to be clear here, and so everybody can take a look, this photograph I think was taken by one of our consultants when preparing the wetlands report. So we're standing on, or perhaps with a drone, on the Ho property, which is the subject parcel that's being, where the array is going to be constructed. This fence line here denotes the boundary line between the Ho property and the Holmes property. Dr. Ho bought the property from the Holmeses several years ago, so it was originally an integrated parcel. When you heard discussion of tree removal on site, it's none of the trees on the Holmeses property. All of the trees that are going to be removed are actually behind the camera and not visible in this photograph. This tree here will remain. The tree, and it's hard to see given the perspective of the picture, but there is a rise in the land here, and if you can imagine a kind of small hump, there are 2 Class 3 wetlands, a small one to the west and a larger one to the east, which would be in this area and that area over here. No material is going to be taken out of those wetlands or deposited into those wetlands.
It's
And
not just about the ridge.
right,
So
so
it still says that your client's planning to dig out 6 feet of land along that ridge, which at a very shallow depth, much less than 6 feet, is going to be bedrock, and that the bedrock is going to have to be removed also, and that in doing that, there's going to be some hydrogeologic effects. Can you just, is she correct? Is that going to happen, or is it not going to happen?
the first part is correct, and I believe the second part is not. The first part is that bedrock is going to be removed here, either by grinding or using a jackhammer. It's going to be removed to a level, if you look at Exhibit JM2, which is the grading plan that was submitted, you'll see that it's a level that's slightly above the 2 existing wetlands, so it'll be slightly proud of that. But the end result will be a site which has a reduced grade from the north, which is this end, to the south, so that the panels, when they're installed, won't shade one another. In terms of the hydrological effects of removing that bedrock, the intervener's witness, Mr. Ravel, never actually went onto this site. He visited only on the Holmes' site and peered over the fence at this and said, aha, I see bedrock, and now I know what the effects of its removal are going to be. So I would characterize his speculation about the effects of that as complete conjecture. What they're hypothesizing is that removing bedrock is going to be like pulling the drain out of a bathtub, and all the water that's south of this uphill is going to drain out and somehow leave this property deep water. You'll see in the evidentiary record that there's no investigation that's ever been done by the Holmeses about any hydrological condition on their site that would allow for instance, a home to be built. There's no perk test that they've done or anything else like this. The comment about this supposed danger is really asking the petitioner to prove a negative. We had a wetland specialist on the site. The wetland specialist saw these seasonal wetlands, Class 3, not connected to anything else, that were on the site, and she assures us that there is no danger to those Class 3 wetlands or any other hydrological resources as a result of removing some bedrock, which is currently above the level of the wetlands. So the wetlands show you what the kind of level of the water is on the Ho site.
Excuse me, did you have a hydrogeologist
We did not.
offer a report?
No, we do not.
And the person who offered the report was?
a wetland specialist working for Trudell Consulting Engineers.
Not a hydro, not qualified hydrogeologist. Is that
Not as far as
correct?
I.
And how much, is it 6 feet down?
There's a slope to the north, so it may be 6 feet in some places. It will certainly be less in others.
And what's the length of the area that's to be excavated?
I don't have that as a
Talking
number.
about 10 feet or like, give me some range.
You have to, I believe Commissioner Hoffman has a copy of the site plan and the grading plan there that will show
Okay,
where the grading's going to take place.
all right, thank you.
Sure.
You indicated that Mr. Revelle just looked over the fence. And
That's what we were told at hearing, yes.
Was he allowed out of the property?
They never asked permission for him to go on the property.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Quite all right. Now, as to process, we heard some comments about this new design being sprung on the interveners. In fact, the petitioner voluntarily offered a round of discovery on any party who had any questions about the revised site plans. The revised site plans were put together specifically to address a question about prime ag soil storage, and they were, if you look at the record, the second set of such plans that we produced. The first set had soil being stored to the south of the project, in between the project and the Holmes's property. But the objection came from interveners that constituted a major amendment, and rather than get bogged down in an argument about whether it was or whether it wasn't, we withdrew those plans and proposed the current set, which were specifically designed to fit within the minor amendment rules. We've seen a lot of argument in the case about whether a percentage change of the project size is relevant. Percentage changes are not part of the Commission's rule or jurisprudence in this case. It really is a limits of disturbance test, as I'm sure you all are aware. In terms of the rock removal, we will be removing some of the rock that we excavate from this site. From the site, it'll be taken away, but when the project is decommissioned, the prime ag soils will be spread over the area where the panels were placed, and I presume the field will be returned to cow grazing or the agricultural purpose that it was originally serving before we came along.
And the rocks being removed, Ms. Hill said something about truck traffic. How many truckloads?
I don't have a number of truckloads here, except to say that it would be roughly analogous to any project of this size that had material that was being removed. References have been made to traffic like a gravel pit. I think that's an unfair characterization. The number of truckloads will depend on the amount of rock that is under the soil there. We won't know the amount of rock that's under the soil until the topsoil is removed and stored. And so there were estimates that were given and questions that were posed on cross-examination, but fundamentally, I don't think you could say the number with certainty.
So when you remove the topsoil,
Yeah.
you're going to make these berms, but do you have to remove it from the site while you're putting up the panels? Or can you make these berms and then put up the panels?
That's in fact what will happen. There's no removal of topsoil from the site at all. It will all stay on site. The lease with the landowner has been amended so that the berms will be within the area under our control. We'll be able to mow them, and we're going to be able to maintain them throughout the life of the project. But in terms of topsoil removal, we would speak about removal from the place where it is currently into the berms, but not off the subject property.
So I'm inferring that since you talked about mowing the berms, that they would be seeded?
Yes, seeded, because the berms are next to the smaller of the two Class 3 wetlands, and we don't want soil from the berms to contaminate the wetlands after heavy rain, so they'll be seeded in and mowed. The landowner does have the option of having sheep or some other ruminant on the berms to eat the grass instead of mowing. So that's also a possibility. There were several comments about a separate site or an alternative site, and criticisms of the petitioner for not considering it. And I believe Chairman Roisman asked me to save some time for that, so let me just get into that for a moment. I think that if we had been approached at the right time with that objection, we would have been open to trying to find a solution that didn't arouse the ire of neighboring landowners. The owners of this project are going to be churches and the town of Shoreham and individuals who frankly couldn't afford to purchase the kind of conflict that we've had in this, so we would have preferred an amicable resolution. I will say that we consider ourselves partially the captives of the rapidly changing regulatory framework. And what I mean by that is if we had chosen a different site, we would have had to resubmit our petition under the new version of Rule 5.100. But with that rule being evaluated every 2 years and the solar adders being decreased every 2 years, moving the site would have also damaged the project economics. But since we applied for this to be built in 2017, the project would get a 4-cent adder for giving our RECs to GMP and for being in a preferred site. Once the objection to the location was raised, the adder had changed. If we had had to refile a new petition, it would have cost the project more, and it would have meant that the investors of the project would not have been able to rely on the original deal that they'd struck. We would have had to go back to them and say, well, we thought it was X dollars per panel, and now it's Y.
Are you aware of our decision in Middletown Springs?
I don't believe I was, no. Right. Well, in this case, we also have a landowner to deal with who is leasing us the least productive acre of her land. It's the rockiest, as you've heard in the discussions of Bedrock, and the acre that she can most easily afford to give up. And so, from her perspective, this was where she was willing to have us. And although we could have raised objections if they were timely, they are not in this case, and no alternative site to this was considered. I should say too that the qualities of this site were worked through extensively with the town before we ever filed the petition. There was a lot of groundwork done with the Planning Commission in Shoreham prior to any petition being filed with the commission. And I think that one of the consequences of doing your homework early that way is that then parties' expectations are set for the project that they agreed would be a good fit with the area. In this case, we're 500 feet from the road at the nearest point. I think that the natural screening that the Hoe Farm provides is going to shield views from nearby homes. None of the nearby homeowners who are closest to the project are actually objecting or are interveners here. They're all people who live further away or who don't have houses on their property, as the Holmeses do not.
Was there any discussion in your original application or any of the pre-file of why this site versus any alternative site was preferable? Or is this something that came up only after the intervener said you could go and use, and then they identified an alternative location on the same property?
I guess the answer is no to the first question. There wasn't a conversation with abutters about potential alternatives. And I should say that there has never been a settlement discussion in this which has gotten past the highly theoretical. So we've never received a proposal or had a serious discussion with the interveners about them dropping their opposition to the project in exchange for choosing a different location. That's something that's being discussed now in the context of the project's aesthetics. And we believe that the mitigation measures in terms of distance, berming, and plantings that we've chosen are more than adequate. And I think you'll find that all of the aesthetics experts in the case, other than the interveners experts, ultimately agree with that assessment.
I just wanna make sure, I do wanna hear from the town.
Yes,
and the
yes, and
department, so he's-
I'm done.
Chairman Morrisman said you have 3 more minutes.
I'd cede them to the 10,
Oh, okay.
or to the DPS, whoever can use.
You want to go first? You want me to go first? All right. Thank you. Good afternoon. Leslie Cadwell for the town of Shoreham. I have just a couple of responses. To address the alternative sites issue, I am familiar with your decision in Middletown Springs. I think the important point in this case is that Ms. Ho is a private property owner, and she selected the portion of her property that's most suitable for the development of solar, so it doesn't impact her farming. I don't think that there was any evidence presented that Mr. Lawrence, the interveners expert, inquired as to whether the location he selected was actually available to use. So when you consider the alternative sites, I think you need to consider whether the site is actually feasible and available. One can't just pick a location on somebody else's property and decide that they're going to build. You need to have the property owner's consent. And in this case, Ms. Ho, as Attorney Marks pointed out, had selected the site for the solar project, and that was done long before Aegis was involved. Mr. Gross testified at hearing, you'll find in the transcript, that he had worked and looked at that site in particular to develop solar in the past, because that's a place that Ms. Ho thought would be appropriate for the farm. So I don't know about any alternatives. I do know that the town of Shoreham would like the solar project in this location on Ms. Ho's property.
And it is the town's reason for that primarily that it's where Ms. Ho was willing to have it, or is there some additional reason why this site is preferable from the town's perspective?
If it were only because Ms. Ho would allow it, it wouldn't meet the town's plan for solar siting. The reason that the town supports this and is an enthusiastic supporter is because it does meet the town's planning criteria for solar siting. And Mr. Gross testified to that. So it's a combination of if the site is compliant with the town plan, as the hearing officer found, and Ms. Ho has agreed to allow solar to be developed on it, for her benefit as well.
But my point was, or the question was, Ms. Hill has said her client would remove their objection if the site were the alternative site that the intervener likes, which is also on Ms. Ho's property, but somewhere, I think, closer to where her barns and other buildings are. If it were at that other site, other than the fact that Ms. Ho doesn't want it there, or at least has not expressed a willingness to have it there, is there some reason why the town prefers this location as opposed to that other location?
Because it meets the solar guidelines in the town plan. If you look at the record, it meets all of the criteria. It doesn't impact the farm. It's not an area that is in active farming now. Farming is an important activity in the town of Shoreham. So this particular location has the characteristics that make it suitable for solar, which is one of the reasons why it was identified early on before Aegis.
But the one by the barn, did they look at that to see if it met the solar siting criteria for Shoreham? Or they never looked at it because the focus was on the other one?
That part,
Can I speak to this?
that part I don't know. It's up to you. If you'd like to hear from George.
Yeah, I have no problem with that.
Okay. So the earliest that the planning commission considered this site was, if I remember correctly, in October 2016, quite a ways back. And at that time, it was presented as a low productivity ag site in a property that has a considerable amount in active use. And from that perspective, it minimized the agricultural productivity impacts. From the perspective of aesthetics, it's over 500 feet away from the nearest public right-of-way. It was almost 1,000 feet away from the Basin Harbor right-of-way. From those perspectives, there was no problem. And the other properties owners that had houses were not objecting to it. That was an assurance we got from ACORN as far back as then. And the other remaining adjacent parcels had no developed residence on them. And so it didn't seem like there was going to be a mitigation issue or a requirement for aesthetic mitigation at that time. Now, obviously, with this long record after that, we've seen this other point of view that even though it's an empty parcel, they were talking about bringing in mitigation. From the Planning Commission's perspective at that time, we saw a very reasonable proposal because it was, in our town plan to do support for renewable energy and our goals, and it minimized its impact on ag soils.
Thank you.
So I have two other points I want to make. One is about the wetlands. The chairman asked Attorney Marks whether the petitioner had hired a hydrologist and done a hydrology report.
A geologist.
I think he said a hydrologist.
So you're both right.
Right. So the interveners and their motion to intervene was based on wetlands, not hydrology. The motion was granted on the basis of wetlands, not hydrology. The interveners failed to get a wetlands expert, somebody who's actually has the same qualifications as the wetlands expert here, because the issue was about wetlands, not hydrology. They ended up hiring a hydrologist, and that's how the hydrology issues were raised. The hydrologist, as as the hearing officer's P4D makes pretty clear, that testimony was not persuasive, in part because he never visited the property and he's not a wetlands ecologist. Then finally, on the issue of the change in, or the major minor amendment issue, particularly with respect to fill and truck traffic and that kind of thing, what I recommend the commission do is go back and look at your order in docket 7948, which is a 2.2 megawatt solar project that involved substantial excavation. That project modified the excavation plan and included additional fill from off-site being trucked in. The commission, and I looked at the order, I can't tell you exactly what the amount was, but I can tell you that when I read the filing way back when, I was surprised to see that the commission ultimately decided that that truck traffic and that additional fill did not amount to a substantial change in the project. And I would posit here that decision provides some good guidance here for this project to demonstrate why Mr. Attorney Marks's position that it was a minor amendment is a fair legal characterization based on the commission's precedent. And then finally, I do appreciate, at least I get a sense that the commission understands when the intervener's attorney argues on behalf of state agencies, that she is not the state agency's attorney. She's not, has no standing to advocate on their behalf on whether they were given notice or not on the major minor amendment. Her clients were provided notice. They were provided an opportunity to be heard. They were provided an opportunity to do cross-examination. There is a very full record. The town of Shoreham would really like to see the commission issue a final order approving the proposal for decision with the minor tweak that we recommended in our comments, just for clarity, because it reflects, this is a really well-written, very well-reasoned decision, and the commission should be proud of the work the hearing officer did and adopt the decision, like I said, with the minor change, and allow the project to be built before the tax credits expire, and while we still can get a little sunshine in production for the benefit of the community members that are participants in the project. Thank you.
The proposal for decision is consistent with the findings and recommendations of our witness in this case, such that the department supports its adoption. I've been looking through my phone to see if our witness directly opined about alternative sites on the record. I don't know if he did. I do know that he was aware of the intervener's alternative proposal, but I do not believe he considered it because it was not a fully developed alternative.
Okay. Anything? Please do. We've got 5 minutes.
Thank you. Just a few brief points. One is that I have to object to a number of the characterizations regarding the consideration of this alternative site and any discussions that might have occurred. The other intervener, independent intervener, Mr. Perry, objected strenuously to the site of this project back in the original filing in 2016. The homes were not, had not been apprised of that, as came out in the record here. The developer did not have their correct address, or was sending things not to the correct address. They were not in the record on that original filing, and then because of the open meeting issues, were not able to participate and voice those concerns in earlier planning commission discussions of this, because they weren't aware of those either. So Mr. Perry objected to this site and suggested alternative sites. I'm not quite sure about on this property, but on other properties and on the town's own property, starting in 2016. As soon as these interveners were appraised and came into this process, they objected to this site as being the highest location on this parcel, the most visible location, visibility in the viewshed analysis by the petitioners of over 2 miles for this project, because it's prominent on this ridge line. It involves taking down maple trees. It's not appropriate topographically for it. It involves all this excavation and a long access driveway and everything else, because it's not an appropriate site. And they did object to this site from the beginning. This notion that if we'd have known earlier that people objected to the site, is just does not ring clear. The transcript.
Still, I think Mark's point was that if they'd known earlier about the proposed alternative site, was there any suggestion made at that early stage when your clients objected to this site, suggesting that there was an alternative site they felt that would have been acceptable to them?
We explored that in our initial discovery, which was the first round of events after the initial petition and pre-filed, and the questions we asked to them on discovery were, would you consider another location? Have you looked at other locations on the site? And the responses in discovery were, no, the project stands on its own merits. End of story. That was the response. No, we're not looking at alternative sites. So that from the beginning of our participation in this procedure, we asked, would you look at alternative sites? Would you talk at alternative sites? Have you looked at other sites on this property, rather than this most prominent site that's going to involve all this earthwork and the wetlands implications and possible, potential damage to Ms. Holmes's properties, wetlands, and spring? And their answer was no. This is our proposal.
Thank you.
And I just want to make one last point regarding the hydrogeologist and the subsurface evaluation. Our hydrogeologist testimony was exactly tied to the wetlands. That's the point. When you take down this bedrock that's effectively the dam to the wetlands are going to either drain or de-water, including the wetlands and the spring on Ms. Holmes' property. It's not just involving the landowner's property. And Mr. Revelle looked carefully at that spring and the wetlands and the land on Ms. Holmes' property, and he has over 40 years of experience in water issues in this exact landscape. The point is that Mr. Petoskey, the petitioner's engineer, said the Soil Conservation Service information regarding this site says you need to do site-specific subsurface evaluation to determine how far down the bedrock and how far down the water is on these soils, and they did not do it. So they're going to excavate, and your question about how long is that excavation, the length of the berms is the length of the project, and the excavation runs the length of the project, which was 323 feet. So it's the whole project site, basically.
So you've talked about the spring on the Holmes' property. Is there a well there as well?
There is not a well, I believe Mr. Ravel testified that in, that would be a site that where there are other development on this property, that spring would naturally be, a well site, but that it is a spring associated with this bedrock formation, and that's in the transcript in his testimony. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you all very much. It's been very informative. We will take it under advisement. Hopefully, we will get a decision in the very near future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kim.
Oh, did we learn what exhibit that is?
I give you a choice of two.
It's okay, Betty, I'll find it, I'll find it.
Just for your orientation, after the technical hearings, there were a set of exhibits that were identified for the record with a list and docket numbers in EPUC, and you'll find it on there as one of the last, because the interveners is the last on the list, and the cross exhibits are the last exhibits on that, of theirs.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah.
Thank you.
I have trouble with going back.
Indeed.
And it's Paul Michelle.